Welcome back to Duralex Sedlex podcast. Today we are joined by a very special guest, Dr. Susanne Täuber. You might be familiar with Dr. Täuber and the movement which surrounds her, #AmINext, as her case was discussed in multiple UCrant articles and was also picked up by national news outlets such as Times Higher Education, Volkskrant and Northern Times. In today's episode, we will discuss Dr. Täuber's case, academic freedom and a recent trend of harsh treatment towards protesters. We are very honoured that Dr. Täuber has taken the time to discuss her case with us. Thank you so much.
First of all, Dr. Täuber, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks for having me. My name is Susanne Täuber. I was born and raised in East Germany. I got my PhD from the University of Jena in social psychology, and I moved to Groningen in 2009. And in my research, I investigate factors that obstruct the translation of policy into actual organizational change, for instance, in the context of gender quotas and diversity programs. But in the past, I have also applied this lens to, for instance, people's motivation to live healthily and to engage in climate change mitigation.
And could you please summarise your case as briefly and as openly as you want to?
Yeah, of course. So my case basically revolves around two core questions, namely, first, can you safely report experiences of discrimination, harassment and power abuse at the university? And secondly, can you safely criticize the system that you are working in, for instance, through publishing critical essays? And my faculty is clearly of the impression that reporting discrimination and publishing a critical essay have damaged the working relationship, which basically gives a free pass to employers to say about anything their employees do that it has damaged the working relationship. And this is, in my view, why this case has caused so much outrage among Dutch and international academics, because it basically means that no one is safe.
Yeah, it touches upon the question of academic freedom for sure. Could you give us an update about your case?
Well, so a very brief sort of recollection of what happened. So we had a public court hearing on February 3rd. And then on International Women's Day on March 8th, I received a ruling that the university may fire me due to damaged working relationships, even though the judge considered, and here I'm quoting from the translated verdict, which Casual Groningen was so nice to do, that the university, including my line manager, played an important, if not a decisive role in the creation of the seriously disrupted working relationship.
Mm-hmm. And as of right now, then that's how it is.
Yeah, that's how it is right now, and so now we're basically preparing the appeal,
okay.
and trying to figure out whether maybe the unions want to join in that, so that I don't have to pay for that myself from my unemployment benefits.
Yeah.
That was it. I mean.
Okay. Yeah. Which state? So the next question is, what steps will you take to challenge your termination, if you will?
Yeah, so I guess the next step is really to appeal this termination, and then just to see what that ruling brings, and then just take it from there. I mean, you can't do much more, can you?
You kind of have to sit and wait a slight bit.
Yeah, and might I ask, what is your motivation behind continuing to challenge your termination?
Yeah, well, now, of course, with that immense movement that you've also already mentioned behind me, and the great outrage that we're seeing, not only in the Netherlands, but also in surrounding countries, I really have the feeling that it's important to fight this through for everyone. Yeah. So I'm really motivated to just do this and see what happens, to get like a principle ruling, and not just this court ruling, like, are the working relationship, are they damaged? Yes, so you can be fired.
What happens, to not have it ambiguous. I think that's quite commendable, personally, to follow it through for that reason. Do you think it's gotten easier since there's been a lot more publicity for you as a person, that it feels less isolating in this position?
Yeah, it's interesting that you choose that word, isolating, because this is actually what happens to many victims of this kind of stuff. But because, I mean, everyone knows I'm not the only one going through this. I'm just the most visible one. And indeed, one of the strategies, of course, is to isolate people. And the past 4 to 5 years have been very isolating. So what is happening now with that support that we get also online is that especially also I think my children really benefit in their mental health from this visible support.
That's very understandable, actually. I didn't think of it like that. Yeah.
That your family is affected as well by it,
Of course, nobody ever thinks about that, but all these victims have family. Everyone is someone's daughter or son or mother, and the families are gravely affected by this kind of harassment and unequal treatment too.
And you said that your case is not like an isolated incident. There's a structure behind it. Could you maybe go a bit more into detail about how do patriarchal structures still endure in academia? Because you've written a lot about it in your work.
Yes, exactly. And of course, I'm just standing on the shoulders of so many people that came before me and that probably have said that much better than I have. But so one of the things I'm always talking about also with my students is we have the Constitution, and the Constitution says everyone is to be treated equally under equal circumstances, right? And you shall not be discriminated against. And so the question is, of course, how can it be that institutions like academia are so unequal still? And I think, so you have to go back, I think, centuries maybe, to see, to start with who has been privileged in these systems from the beginning. So one of the things I always share with my students is this little graph. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's about who has been exempted from paying study fees at the University of Groningen between 1700 and 1800, right? So for most of the people, they just don't know. But then here they have people who are poor and people who are related to the mayor or other professors or the clerics. And so what you basically see is that while there's only 5% of exemptions because the students were poor, 25% of the exemptions to the study fees are because people are related to, they are family of. So if you think about that, it's like rich people giving deductions to rich people, right? So, and you do this for centuries. And then nowadays, people are talking about programs like the Rosalind Franklin Fellowship as affirmative action or positive discrimination, which is just, it's just outrageous, right? It should be called, I don't know, reparations, finally, making the world a bit more equal for everyone. So I think this is really important to keep in mind, that there are people privileged for centuries by unequal systems. And then the next question is, of course, how is that privilege sort of passed on, even nowadays, that we are so committed to more equal and diverse organizations? And this is through inequality regimes. This is basically what my essay was about. The essay from 2019, Undoing Gender in Academia, is describing exactly this, how daily inequality practices that are informal, they are written down nowhere, but how they undermine and thwart the formal equality programs. And this is how this works.
So you argue that there's like these patriarchal structures are not only based on gender, but also on nepotism. So
it's based on everything, like gender, race, able-bodiedness, heterosexuality, you name it, it's based on that. So most organizations are made for a very narrowly defined kind of person, and sort of works against the rest, or only seems to work superficially for the rest, but doesn't really.
It works really well for the few, and kind of sort of works every few days for the others.
Yeah, something like that.
If you don't fit the mold, then it's harder for you to
exactly.
to succeed in those structures, for sure. Yeah.
And one of the things is, so people often ask me, but so then it's like trivial things, right? So every day it's like a trivial thing. So you organize a conference.
Okay.
And your male colleague also organizes a conference, and his conference is talked about broadly on social media, but your conference gets sort of no mention at all.
Yeah. So it's not, no one is writing these things down, and that's why I think some people have a very hard time to admit that it's there, because they're like, well, on paper, everything is equal. What are you saying? Everyone has equal rights now. But in application, does everybody have the same amount of opportunities even?
Yeah, exactly. And also, I mean, what we heard a lot from the people that we interviewed for the Young Academy report is, for instance, a very unequal distribution of teaching and research time. And then you have gendered criteria of performance criteria in organizations. So in academia, for instance, the amount of publications or the number of publications that you produce is considered a gendered criterion. Exactly because of that, because men get more research time, hence they can produce more publications. Hence that they have more publications is confounded by, so the number of publications is confounded with gender and basically doesn't tell you really much about someone's real quality as a scientist.
I'd never thought of it like that. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And you're just saying the dichotomy there. So our next question is about the gendered pay gap in academia now. Is there anything that you could, explain to us about that?
Yeah, of course. So, but this is really nice to as a follow-up question on these inequality regimes, because but you say, I've never thought about that way, right? And this is exactly how this works the best. You think something is legitimate, so you do not consider it as unequal. So, for instance, if my line manager says, well, you are not getting this promotion because you didn't publish as much as your male colleague, it seems perfectly fair.
Yeah.
Up until the point that you go like, but wait a minute, I was teaching much more than that guy. So if you plot, my output against my research time, actually I'm publishing more.
If you question the structures behind it and behind the result as well, then you realize how what a large role gender still plays.
Yes, exactly. And if you take into account the resources each colleague of yours gets, and you then consider the output they produce, you will, figure out that many of the underrepresented group members are actually doing much better. But anyhow, so you have these gendered promotion criteria, which means your male colleague or your white colleague or your able-bodied or heterosexual cisgendered colleague, whatever, gets promoted more easily and quicker. And this, of course, is visible in salary as well. So you have the kind of pay gap that comes from, discrimination in promotion decisions. But you also have one, and this is one I brought with you again, because what we often get as a criticism about gender studies is that it's something like not real science. Well, I beg to differ. It's absolutely real science. So these are graphs from an American study. Okay. So what you have to know is that the Americans can do better empirical studies because they have access to much larger data sets. And in Europe, because of our data protection law, we don't have that yet. So I hope this will change one way or the other. But what this person did is she was looking at inequality reproduction in the STEM fields in the US. And it's a very recent study, just from last year. And she was saying, so there is a kind of norm group in STEM fields, which is the white, heterosexual, able-bodied men. She calls that WHAM. Abbreviated,
nice abbreviation, right? Yeah.
So what she did is she was plotting this norm group against 31 other demographic groups. So people who are people of color, who are disabled, who are homosexual or part of the LGBTQ plus community. Yeah. You name it, she plotted it. So what she finds then is, for instance, here, this graph is social inclusion, and you will always have the norm group as the sort of the standard. So this is at the zero of the scale, right? Yep. And then you see how other people divert from that, right? So you see that the norm group, so the WHAMs, they are most socially included in the workplace. And then here at the very end, you have LGBTQ plus black women with disabilities. So they are the least included. But then, that's social inclusion. Then you have here the proportion of people experiencing harassment at work. So you see the same, right? The WHAMs experience the least harassment, and compared to them, the other groups experience quite a lot. Yeah. Then there's experience of professional respect, where you see it goes down for the other groups, right? And then the most interesting one and probably also the most shocking one is salary. So on average, the WAM group earns around $25,000 a year more than the other groups. And that's just like financial violence, right?
Yeah.
That's a gigantic difference in pay.
Yeah. There's such a big jump between the WAM and the non-WAM that's what's so concerning. It's either in this group or you're not in this group.
Mm-hmm.
And
Exactly.
that's really expressed to that.
Exactly. And so what I liked about this research is that she also tried to account for stuff that could explain these differences, right? If you had a higher education, it makes sense that you would earn more money, right?
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. The white part of these bars is the unexplained variance. So you see that the white part is quite large for each of these bars. So this is just a premium that the norm group receives for belonging to the norm group.
Yeah.
They didn't work anything
Just for
it.
fitting the mold.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's nearly around 80% for each
Yes.
graph. That's insane.
Yeah.
That's
But that's what I'm saying. I mean, it's insane. We have like stacks of empirical data showing that. So why people would always, play the woke card on that, I really don't understand. So this is just hard science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just detecting a structure of gender-based or able-body-based differences and inequality.
Exactly.
And usually on protected grounds as well. We have to talk about it. I do international and European law, but with technology law, and there's kind of protected, I suppose, reasons that you shouldn't be discriminated against, i.e. gender, religion, sexuality, and these
race
seem to
as
be
well.
race as well.
Ethnicity,
and they tick all those boxes.
Yeah, exactly. And so what we're doing right now in the Netherlands is really, for the past 2 years, I would say, we're in negotiations trying to get an independent monitoring on the universities on these factors, because we can't have that so far, because the university says, but this is not allowed. This is in violation of the European...
of the GDPR.
So it works in their favor.
But if you want to really break the structures, then you have to, of course, provide the data in order to prove your points. This actually brings us to our next question. Besides affirmative actions, how can one counteract those gendered criteria and those structural inequalities? Is there a way to do it?
Well, I mean, I would say that through all the work we have done over the past years, we at least know now a lot of measures that don't really work. So, I mean, we have introduced a lot of things, right? Confidential advisors on central level, on faculty level, diversity and inclusion officers, central and on the faculty level, ombudsmen. What else do we have? Zero tolerance policies, active bystander training, code of conduct. It's all very, very beautiful on paper.
Yeah.
It doesn't do anything about the source problems of harassment, which is the hierarchy, the strong dependency on just one or two people, and the very, very high, insane competitiveness in the system. And the problem is with these things. So if you never change the sources of the problem, you're just sort of
patching it up. It's like putting a plaster on.
Exactly.
In any other situation, if it was anything else like an illness, you'd go to the source. You wouldn't, if it's anything else in a system.
Yeah.
As children, we're taught to look at the source, so it seems.
But so maybe
nonsensical.
But maybe you are. You have experiences with that too as students. So you might have become overwhelmed with all your studies and your exams, and you couldn't really cope and keep up. And then people would say to you, "Oh, why don't you do a time management training, or do a bit of mindfulness training?" But this is like plasters on a really insanely inhumane system. So you should change the system and not send the problem suffering from the system to self-improve so that he or she fits better into the mold.
Yeah. So restructuring would be necessary, you would argue that?
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest problems we have with the social safety and the harassment is, so as we said right in the beginning of this conversation, there are of course people who benefit tremendously from the inequality in the system.
Mm-hmm.
These are the people in power, and these are the people tasked with changing the system to become more equal,
Mm-hmm.
which of course it's a ridiculous idea. Why would they do that?
Yeah, it's the same. I think this kind of patriarchal and power structure is also cropping up as well when we talk about climate change and we talk about different structures and we talk about, I don't know, billionaires who pay too few taxes. Why would they change the system for themselves? Why would anybody, so we have to do something, or it has to come from us in order to enact a change.
Yes, exactly.
If we could go back to your work, in your work you mentioned the role of crown princes and princesses. Could you maybe go a bit into detail about what this role is?
Yeah, so what we saw a lot, so people mentioned this in the Young Academy report a lot, that they would observe that sort of their line manager or the department chair would have these crown princes or crown princesses, that they would sort of massage into higher positions, right? While everyone else was like struggling and trying to get promoted, these would be people that are just being promoted based on, being friends or being trustworthy to those in power, and people were quite angry about that. And I was also surprised by how obvious it was to people, because what you also mentioned, Eva, right, is that oftentimes you don't even see these processes happening, but the people we talked to, they were quite clear that this is happening.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we can, once you've explained it, because it wasn't a term that I was familiar with before coming across your work, and I think it's quite apparent in most walks of life that this happens.
Yeah.
I think even in school I can think of this happening.
Yeah, and I think with celebrities, right, they have now coined the term Nepo baby.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think you have Nepo babies all over academia as well, of course, and in the media, and
I mean, it's easier to know what to do and where the next step is if someone's been showing you and pruning you like a little bonsai your whole life of how to get from A to B to C.
Yeah.
But especially like with the graph you showed us earlier, how people with a close relationship to the mayor, for instance, or politicians, etc., how they tend to get financially supported, even though they might not need it. They might not be the ones in need of financial support. So that really shows you how structural nepotism actually is. And it would, of course, make sense that it also endures in academia.
Yeah, and they never call it affirmative action when it's stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Although actually it is.
Yeah. But it just has been going on for so long that it's become the norm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Our next question is how is bullying utilised in academia? So with regards to push the princes or the princesses, the crown princes and princesses.
Yeah, exactly. So the Dutch network of female professors, they published a report in 2019, and I thought it was quite a landmark report for the Netherlands. It was called Harassment in Dutch Academia, and they interviewed 53 people, if I remember correctly. Women from all the universities in the Netherlands, and what they found is like a pattern of harassment they thought was quite unique to academia, which revolves around career sabotage. So they define that as all behaviors that directly obstruct a person's work as a scientist and their careers. And these kinds of behaviors are, for instance, the refusals of promotion, even though you're doing equally well as other people who are getting the promotion, but also the denial of tasks or functions that people need for promotion. So imagine that in order to qualify for promotion, you need to be able to show that you have leadership qualities, but your line manager never allows you to attend the leadership course. Then, of course, legitimately, he can say, well, but you don't have these skills. And there's very little you can do about it, because the moment that you start complaining, you are actually causing a fuss, and then that's
you're being difficult.
Exactly, that's the prompt to call HR in, and then it's going to be very ugly very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But there's other stuff, and that's probably maybe things that you even as a student maybe experience. So, for instance, claiming people's ideas as one's own ideas and just running with it, unjustified authorships, but also subordinating people in assigning management and research tasks. One of the things we talked about earlier is making people's ideas and contributions invisible. But also, for instance, blocking access to spaces, documents, objects, or information, labeling people as incompetent. And what they even found, I thought that was quite shocking actually, but the physical or financial destruction of a person's research project. So these are all cases they collected, right? This happened. Yeah.
That's sorry, just I can't. The physical and financial destruction of work and research just seems so. It is like something someone would write. It doesn't. You know, when you look at the system, especially in a country like the Netherlands, which prides itself on equality and I think progressiveness, and I do understand there's quite a large counter movement to that at the moment, but it's just I'm dumbfounded at this.
It sounds like a severe punishment for just doing one's job or pointing out harassment, for instance, or like those structures of inequality to being punished by endangering one's life and work, especially
it's a livelihood. This isn't a hobby, and it's not something that you're doing just because you're interested. Yes, you are, but it is also your career.
Yeah,
and it's
exactly.
also just as legitimate as any other way to.
Yeah, exactly. And people don't often talk about this so far. It's really also an existential threat, and it's a kind of financial violence indeed. And the let's say. The context in which we talk about this so far mostly is our colleagues on fixed-term contracts, right? Who are precariously employed, who are sort of like the gig workers of the academic economy, and who never can, pay for a decent house. Who have to have 2 or 3 of these jobs to even make ends meet. So this is where we see that, but indeed, once you are targeted, even in a permanent position, as I was in, this kind of violence can also affect you. Yes.
Yeah. How one's livelihood is used as leverage in order to make them maybe be quiet about certain inequalities they experience. Earlier, you mentioned that if one voices their opinion and criticism, HR usually comes in quite fast. Is there still a way or form how one can report harassment and misconduct?
Well, I don't want to take away all hope, but I haven't really found an effective way, right? Because effective at this point in time means complaining in a way that doesn't cost you your job, but that usually also means that your complaint sort of dies off, right? So this is actually something that we investigated quite intensely in the Young Academy report, where we didn't just ask people, what do you experience here, but also what are your experiences in the reporting and complaint system. And this was really quite shocking because, first of all, this is not incidental, right? So it's not like someone says something racist to you and then you report it, and a week after that you have a conversation and then it's all good again. No, people are in these situations for years because the complaint system is so inadequate that it's almost unbelievable. So people are being sent from one person to the next, and then to the next, and then to the next. All the while, they are being framed as individual troublemakers, hysterical people, lacking a sense of humor, right? Not understanding Dutch culture well. So it's all made their problem, and that is sort of the way out. So then what we often see is, so your employer sort of makes a promise, doesn't fulfill the promise, you are complaining. Then HR comes in because apparently you have a communication problem because you issue a criticism. And then they offer you something much less than the initial promise. And if you don't take that, you're being a very difficult person, ungrateful. and basically causing a conflict. So this is a pattern we saw again and again and again. So we interviewed 26 people, and about 60% of our interviewees were experiencing this kind of retaliation. So they got their research taken away, PhD students taken away, teaching taken away. They were prevented from taking certain career opportunities. I mean, and there are also people who, got fired or eventually gave up and went away on their own accord.
Constructive dismissal, I think, is the exactly.
Yeah.
Do you
Very
think
constructive.
Well, yeah. Do you find it condescending that they refer to these issues as communication problems? Because it implies that there's an onus on both sides.
Yeah, but that's exactly, of course, that's exactly the strategy a powerful unequal system that wants to maintain itself would use, right? So, and that's one of the problems we have. So in this system, the people with power have the right to say, this is the truth. So your criticism is not true, but me saying you have a communication problem is true. So it's never like we differ in opinion about what that is. No, it's I'm your boss, so I'm correct. And if you can't accept that, you need to go. And this is also how the system reproduces itself, because the people who really want to change the system, who really don't buy into this, get, spitted out like I did, or they leave on their own accord. And what you keep, what's left over in the system
are the people that agree and that fit in the system.
Yeah, which will never lead to a change in the system, of course. Yeah.
And it's not only that they fit into the system, right? There are also many people who don't fit into the system, but who are too afraid to speak up. Because, I mean,
I was going to say they forcibly, in a way, then make themselves fit in the system, and that's not something that they should feel guilty about. I'm not saying that the system shouldn't be in place, but again, it's still they're trying to fit this mold. I was just wondering, do you think part of this has come from or the system has generated from a environment that now is turning academia into a more business model?
Yes.
That there's a lot more money behind it, because in a utopia, academia should be really ethical and should be more about what you really want to study or what you want to research, and you find, but that's not the case in the real world. There's a lot of money behind it, and I think that's what's driving this.
Yes, and I think you see that in more organizations, of course, not just academia, but it's of course a real big pity in organizations like academia, because we are publicly funded. So how you can actually defend this kind of conduct while claiming that you're acting in the public's interest, I think that's increasingly difficult to defend, really.
Yeah, I'd have to. It seems, to me, it seems very like an undefendable position. It's not something that I'd want to try and do in a hurry. And the fact that this is the line that they're choosing of their own accord, I think it says a lot about the institution and the system.
Yeah. The structure behind it again, especially you said that there's like not in one of your works you say that there's not like a robust plan in action in order to report harassment, for instance, but it sounds like there's a robust plan in action in order to silence those voices. So that's very paradox for me.
Yeah. In one of your works, you mentioned that the problem is that universities treat harassment as a public relations crisis. Is your case a fitting example of this kind of problematic problem?
Well, I would say my case started out as one of these public relation that they were trying to, get rid of the person that exposed the problem. I mean, this is what Sarah Ahmed, of course, already has explained in much better words than I did. But like when you expose a problem, you pose a problem. So the sort of the knee-jerk reflex of an organization that is very committed to their reputation to the outside world is to make the problem go away. So once they can point at you as the problem owner, the container where the problem belongs, right? Rather than pointing at them for their structural inequality, it's easier to get rid of you as a person than to change the system, right? Yeah. It's just in my case, this making it go away just made it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think actually that some of my colleagues in media studies might use this case for their classes, because this is really a major up.
It's very interesting to see how the university reacts, but also like how, for instance, newspaper outlets like Ukrand, how they react and how they discuss your case as well. In one of your papers, you also state that bullies are generally protected with public resources. Could you maybe go a bit more into detail and explain how public resources are utilized to protect these bullies?
Yeah, I mean, partly, of course, within that complaint and report system, right, because that is already paid with public money. But then also, for instance, if you look at cases like my case, and I'm really not an exception, don't believe that just because I'm the one in the newspapers, I'm the only case. So there are dozens of cases like me, just not making the newspaper. But they are paying lawyers. Like in my case, for 4 to 5 years, they have paid multiple lawyers dealing with my case. I mean, I don't know if this is a responsible way of using taxpayers' money that is actually meant for education and research, right?
That's a really good point, because all this money that they're using, and they're kind of academia is such business now. I think we can see that from the university, from the amount of international students that the university has taken in, and how the government has said that you need to stop taking internationals. And I think there is a link between that and money, that they're in a way wasting all this money on lawyers and litigation that could be going towards research, and could be going towards people that need to get more research. So
towards more grants, for instance.
It seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, and also what you get a lot is with especially the colleagues on these precarious contracts, right? They are really, really good scientists, really good lecturers. You students benefit greatly from the courses they teach, but then they are sort of, they don't get an extension, they don't get a permanent contract, particularly not if they speak up. So we've had multiple cases of people who criticized the university for instance, for nepotism, like Sujata de Poel, also from my faculty. And when they are on fixed term contracts, they are very, very easy to dismiss, right? So it's very easy for the university to get rid of these people, and that comes at a cost for the continuity of education. It means that you students, get lower quality education.
And it also could endanger, of course, academic freedom, which is which was discussed in one of the latest articles of with Ukrand, I think, where you gave an interview about academic freedom. How such practices actually is endangering this freedom. You said that there should be global prohibitions against these practices where university lawyers are engaged. Could you maybe go a bit more into detail about what you meant by that statement? Or at least that was in one of the papers of yours.
Well, so what I think is, we need to focus on the Netherlands, right? Because this is the legal system that we are operating in. So you can't really follow the US system or the UK system or so. But I do think that we should follow some ideas in these other systems. So for instance, I know that my colleagues in the US are now really advocating for constructing harassment as an attack on human dignity, which it is. If you read in the Young Academy report the kind of effects that this harassment has on people's mental and physical health, their careers, their livelihoods, it really is an attack on human dignity. Our French colleagues have just achieved that workplace harassment is a criminal offense. And I do think that behaviors like coercive control, which we also find a lot in these cases here in the university, is also becoming a criminal offense. Of course, this needs to be enforced, but I think the Netherlands actually are way, way behind any of that. I think that employees in the Netherlands are really not protected very well.
And that in case they voice voice harassment claims and so on, that their livelihood are at stake, of course, with their contracts being terminated.
Why do you think the Netherlands in particular is not?
Well, you tell me. I know that Germany is equally bad, and Switzerland as well. I don't know. I mean, the Netherlands, for instance, did this move that that university employees are not civil servants anymore, which means they're less well protected, right? In Germany, you would be still a civil servant. Not that that protects people there at all, to be honest.
No, it doesn't. Yeah.
And but so one of the things, for instance, and this is why I think it's important to sort of take my case to a higher level and have get a ruling based on principles.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this, for instance, this responsibility. There's a duty of care. Right, for universities, for their employees, but somehow this duty of care seems to extend only to the harassers and not to their victims, right?
Okay.
So in reality, there's also a duty to provide socially safe working and learning environments, which I asked for, right?
Yeah.
And which I didn't get. So it's actually really so. There needs to be now a testing, a good testing, to see where are the loopholes in this legislation, what does need to be fixed, and how can we fix it.
And maybe not prioritize the public relations crisis over the person being fired.
No, exactly. You know, what I always think is what would be really helpful is if universities would take pride in how adequately and effectively they deal with harassment, rather than being so afraid that harassment is going on. I mean, everyone knows that harassment is going on. We know it's not incidental, it's structural. It's because academia is such an unequal system. So why pretend? Why not, you know?
Yeah, like I think you're absolutely right on that one, because for students, whether it's bachelor's, master's, I suppose PhD students, I think that it would be much more of a draw to go to an institution and attend an institution that you felt safe in, that you knew that if something was to happen, there's adequate safeguards in place and people are going to deal with it seriously. Because even at 20 years old, I know that this harassment is widespread, and you're not going to find an institution anywhere where it just doesn't happen. That's too much of a utopia, and I think it's really clear that what you're asking isn't that necessarily, okay, in an ideal world, it wouldn't happen. But you can't, Rome wasn't built in a day, but you can put something else in place to try and help with that.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there's a lot of stuff I think we could do better, right? So, for instance, stop with producing nice brochures and papers saying we have this zero tolerance policy if you're not enforcing it, right? Have independent agencies look at this, like have a national ombudsman, have a monitoring on a national level. I mean, we've been allowing universities to self-regulate their social safety, diversity and inclusion campaigns now for years. We see it doesn't really work out too well, or it takes much too long to change. So why not have a bit more enforcement and regulation external to the universities?
Yeah. And I think, like, at least speaking for myself, I would prefer a university that is self-critical and self-reflective and also admits to its fault, of course, but actively tries to work on it.
So on our Instagram story, we asked if anybody had any questions for you. So a few people got back to us, and I suppose we'll start with those. So what advice would you give to students who want to fight in a path like yours?
Yeah, so I think the most effective thing to do is to get organized and to find support among your peers, because as we said earlier in this conversation, right, the isolation is the biggest threat. And the isolation, if you self-isolate, if you think, oh, this is all my own fault and maybe I am not a worthy person, that's going to just work in favor of the system. So you can know for sure that just in your close vicinity, there are at least a couple of students who have experienced what you also have experienced. So try to find them, try to sort of get this social affirmation that you're not alone, and then try to organize. Because also, if you are with a group of people, it's much more difficult to dismiss what you have experienced as an incident. You can show a pattern, and that's important.
Okay.
And you already touched upon that topic, but one of the students asked, how would you envision the ideal scenario to raise and address issues of discrimination in the workplace or academia setting?
Yeah, so I actually really, I'm very fond of a national ombudsman. I mean, I know that Germany has a national ombudsman, and it's not that it's much better there, but I think it's one, you have to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So for people to start with a person who is truly independent of the universities, who is truly external to the universities, who can also see patterns again on a national level, I think that would be that would be so effective and would mean so much to people who, you know, are experiencing this stuff and don't feel safe enough to report it within their own institution.
So firstly, it would be crucial to gather that data in order to have solid proof, as you said, and then put a real system into place which points out this harassment.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I mean, I would like that this would be just common knowledge. I mean, that there is discrimination in academia. We know that. You know, the Dutch Network for Female Professors, they are publishing a monitor on that each year. Each year we see there are more men in professorships than women. Each year we see there are more women in these non-permanent contracts than men, etc., etc. So we know there is discrimination going on. And still, when I'm in court, the judge asks me, explain precisely how you as an individual got discriminated against. It's very difficult to do, right?
Yeah.
So I would actually advocate for a system where we say, okay, we know this is going on. So we believe the person reporting at least the same amount as we believe the person they have reported, right?
Of course, like
No, it's really important. Yeah.
keeping and considering the structural harassment that's actually happening and keeping that in mind, of course. Yeah, acknowledging it as well.
Why is it essential for universities to make a conscious effort to be inclusive?
So as we talked about in the beginning of this conversation, that universities have always been unequal. Universities have never been this enlightened, civilized space where everyone was in a utopian way equal. They've always been unequal. So that means the people who are benefiting from this system will be totally unaware. So that means they will have to put in conscious effort to make this a more inclusive system. It means they will have to take the effort to reflect on their own privilege and their power, whether it's really because they put in so much effort or whether they get maybe some presents and premiums along the way. And from that position, from a critical reflection of your own positionality, then really do conscious work on making this system more equal.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of as a sub-question, that what do you say to people that turn around and say academia or things like that, they're getting too woke, we're trying to be too inclusive, and there's people that are only put there so that there's a woman in a certain position or someone of colour.
Certain ratios are accomplished,
What's
well,
your say?
I mean, there's an easy answer to that, right? All taxpayers pay for this system, so all taxpayers should benefit from this system.
And be represented by the system.
And the research we produce and the education we provide is not inclusive. They are not speaking to all of these persons. And there's also from the US colleagues very nice data showing that because people who are belonging to minoritized groups often focus on specific topics like migration, social injustice, political identity, you know, that kind of stuff. These topics get pushed out of the system as well. We just don't produce any insights on it.
Oh, that's really
Did you know, for instance, that Elsevier last year, 2022, has for the first time ever published a correct anatomical model of a woman? Did you know that? Can you believe that?
No. No,
because there's there's hardly any research into the woman body, how females respond to medicine, you know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's weird.
Yeah. It's the result of a structure that we have. And of course, as you said, the structure's also in place and within academia, not only within our private lives, but also detectable here, obviously. And do you believe the RUC should be held more accountable in this regard, including more people from different backgrounds, for instance?
Yeah, but I mean, being held accountable is a totally different thing than recruiting diverse employees, right? Because most of our universities are by now quite good in recruiting diverse employees, but they're not that good at letting them proceed in their careers in the same speed or to the same amount of people that make it through the system. And they're also not as good in keeping them, right? So recruiting is going okay. Retaining is going not so well. They call that a revolving door effect. So you come in and then you get out again. And so, being held accountable. Well, I think the taxpayer has a right to the best possible education and research that we can offer.
That's a very interesting approach, and actually something I haven't considered before, that the system is paid for by everyone, so everyone should be part of the system as well and represented by the system. Yeah,
I think that's a very interesting answer, because it's good, because it's one of those it satisfies that kind of, well, as a taxpayer, that kind of statement.
So coming to our last question, we wanted to ask you about the current treatment of protesters. In preparation of our interview, we came across articles and comments claiming that there's a visible trend of shutting up protests by threatening activists with prison sentences, for instances, or repercussions. This so-called burn one, scare thousand tactic is often used to deter others from speaking up and standing in solidarity. So do you believe that there's a pattern of disproportionate punishment of protesters lately as well?
Yes, I do believe there is. You were mentioning, right, protesters, for instance, from Extinction Rebellion, or these people who are blocking the streets. I'm not sure how the Dutch police went about them. I just remember that like 700 people were arrested, which I thought was crazy in and of itself. But then from the UK, of course, we hear these stories of people who are actually spending weeks, sometimes months, in prison cells just for blocking a road. Which is insane if you think about it. They get a criminal record, they maybe lose their jobs, they have family, and of course it deters people from doing the same, right? I mean, this is also what I think my case basically is about. It's just showing people this is what happens to you if you can't shut up, right? If
make
you
a deterrent example.
Exactly. If you challenge the system, this is what we will make you go through. So think about it twice. And of course, you already see that, right? I'm getting WhatsApp, from colleagues who are like, we really wanted to sign the petition on your behalf, but we just don't dare. So this is how effective this system works. And these protesters, of course, they are again protesting for all of us. It's against climate change. It's against fossil fuels. It's to help migrants coming, in insane journeys in these tiny boats. Yeah. So it's these topics that sort of become increasingly shut down, punished, and silenced. Yeah.
Do you think it's a kind of modern or 21st century way of making things taboo? Of if it's just not in the zeitgeist, if it's not spoken about?
Yeah, I'm not so sure whether it's about making things taboo. I think so. If I'm looking at the bigger pattern of what's happening in the world, I think what we're now experiencing is a huge backlash of the conservative powers that feel threatened by the progress we have made. Because you see, like in the US and Poland, sexual and reproductive health is being cut back. You see LGBTQ rights are being cut back. Same-sex marriages are under threat. The protesters are being disproportionately punished. So in that respect, I'm feeling like I'm just one tiny symptom of a much, much bigger backlash against progress. And I think this is something to really pay attention to and do something about, maybe.
Yeah, of course, because as you said, like, you are protecting academic, or your case is an example of how important it is to protect academic freedom. So it is very essential, even though it's, as you said, maybe just a small symptom. It's still a very crucial case.
I suppose I had one question. It was just, have you received any backlash of kind of hate online since you've started doing this?
Well, I'm not reading the comments under
Good.
the Ukraine articles anymore. And I actually, I mean, even after we published the Young Academy report, we got very creative. How do you say that? Curse words on the usual suspects platform. So I'm not engaging with this.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. For the mental health as well, for sure. Yeah, but we want to thank you so much for being part of our podcast and taking the time to discuss your very important and, as I said, crucial case with us, and especially also touching upon points such as structural inequalities within academia was very, very interesting.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That's it for today's episode. We hope you enjoyed listening to our interview with Dr. Täuber. We wish her all the best in the future. If you enjoyed this episode, please share, follow, and like the podcast wherever you get your podcast.
You can follow us on Instagram @JerryLikesSaidLikesPod and LinkedIn JerryLikesSaidLikes for all updates and news. That's it for today. Until next time.